I took advantage of the snowy weather this weekend to stay indoors and reread Madeleine L'Engle's A Circle of Quiet. Some of you may know her as the author of the children's classic, A Wrinkle in Time. But this book is different, quieter, more reflective. A memoir about faith and family and trying to find God in the middle of ordinary life. Now, if A Circle of Quiet sounds familiar, it's because it is the book we'll be reading together on Sunday evenings during Lent this year. L'Engle wrote it in the late 1960s from her rural Connecticut homestead. And precious to the story is a small glade near a brook on her family's land. It is not famous or known to others. It is simply a clearing not far from her house, where the trees open and the water keeps its steady course over stone. She describes it so eloquently you can almost hear the brook and see the light filtering through branches and the ground worn soft by seasons of return. If I'm being honest, I find myself longing for a place like that, even though I know I must walk past such places every time I enter the woods. L'Engle writes that she goes to this clearing whenever life feels crowded. Crowded by unfinished work, crowded by expectation, crowded by the small, steady demands that press against a day until there is no margin left. She does not go there to escape her life or the world. She goes there to remember it. And she does not remain there. After a time, she returns to her desk. She returns to her children. She returns to her unfinished manuscripts. The clearing does not remove her from her life. It returns her to it, steadier, truer, closer to her true size. There is a kind of honesty that only comes in such places, when a person sits long enough for breathing to slow, when the mind that has been racing ahead begins to return, when the body unclenches and the soul finally catches up, when the noise settles enough that what is true can be heard once again. Most of us are not practiced at that kind of returning. Our days fill quickly. Work, obligations, conversations, responsibilities, they pile up. We move from one thing to the next and we call it necessary. We call it productive. We even call it faithful. But there is a difference between faithfulness and frenzy. Along the coast in late winter, we know the wind to press against a house for days. You hear it in the eaves, you feel it in the window glass, the porch boards creak, the storm door rattles, even indoors, something in you braces. I notice that wind in myself sometimes, how quickly I move from one thing to the next, how easily I begin measuring my worth by what I've finished or how well I've responded. And when I do, I can feel something in me growing thin. There are winds moving through our common life that feel just as relentless. The endless scroll, the constantly breaking headlines, the demand to react immediately, to secure what feels fragile before it slips away. If we are not careful, we begin to take our shape from that very urgency. And a soul cannot live long that way without becoming brittle. That is where the church, in her ancient wisdom, gives us Lent. For centuries, Christians have set aside these 40 days before Easter as a time to return, to pray, to fast, to remember who and whose we are. Not because the world grows calmer this time of year, not because our obligations diminish, but because we need a clearing, a circle drawn in time, not so we can hide there, but so we can return to the world steady enough to love it well. In the gospel we heard this morning, before Jesus speaks a word in public, before he heals or teaches or gathers anyone to himself, he goes into the wilderness. Matthew tells us that he is led there by the Spirit. But we must remember that before the wilderness, there was water. Before the hunger, before the testing, before the accusations, there was a river, steady and unhurried. It was there, in the water of his baptism, that Jesus began. He went down into the river, and when he came up, the heavens opened up. And in that stillness, a voice spoke, "You are my beloved." That word did not come after his accomplishments. It came before it. It came even before the wilderness. The wilderness did not give him a new name. It gave him the chance to trust the name he had already received. The temptations that we hear about in the story of the wilderness are ordinary and close to the bone. If you are hungry, feed yourself. If you are beloved, prove it. If you are truly called, claim your own power. Each one suggests that identity must be demonstrated and defended. And we see Jesus hungry, truly hungry, after 40 days in the wilderness. That river, it's behind him. The voice that named him beloved is not speaking to him. There is only dust, silence, and the ache of his body. Which is why the tempter does not offer him something absurd. He offers him relief, bread instead of hunger, proof instead of trust, authority without waiting. But Jesus does not scramble. He answers from deeper ground of who he already knows himself to be. Jesus chooses trust. He chooses worship. He chooses to remain rooted in the one who named him. The voice spoken over him in the river was enough to carry him through the desert. And he stands inside what has already been said. When we no longer need to prove ourselves, only then are we free. Free to refuse false power, free to trust God's provision, free to worship God alone. What was true for him, friends, is true for us. In our own baptism, whether we remember it or not, we too have gone down into water and come up named before we achieved anything at all. We were named beloved. And like Jesus, we are invited to trust that, to live that in all we do. But friends, we know that beloved people are not meant to remain at the water's edge. The river did not spare Jesus the wilderness. The wilderness did not spare him the road. The road did not spare him the cross. But he did not walk scrambling for a name. Something in him was settled in that wilderness, and that is good news for us. Lent does not remove us from the wind. It gives us a clearing within it, not an escape, but formation. The practices of Lent are not spiritual achievements. They are ways of stepping down into the river again. Fasting loosens urgency. Prayer returns us to listening. Confession clears what has grown false in us. And giving opens our hands and our hearts. None of these practices earn us a new name, but they help us remember the one already spoken so that we can live from it. And sometimes remembering requires a shape. A rule of life is simply that. A few steady, life-giving practices that help us return to the water when the days grow crowded. And this Lent, some of us will explore that together, growing a rule of life, guided by the Reverend Ann Williamson, not to add more to our calendars, but to help us choose what steadies us. It is one way of drawing a small clearing inside ordinary days. And that is also why we are spending this season reading this book and reflecting on spiritual autobiographies, learning to look back over the landscape of our own lives to notice where the water has already been moving. Perhaps Lent is less about becoming something new and more about returning to the voice beneath all the other voices, returning to the love spoken over us in the water. Friends, this Lent, step into the clearing, not to escape, but to remember. Stand there long enough to hear again what has been true all along. And when you return rooted in Jesus, return grounded in love, steady enough to love your neighbor in a restless world, courageous enough to resist what diminishes life, and faithful enough to worship God alone, remembering again and always your belovedness. Amen.